Unlike you or your family, a pea in a pod cannot think and is good to eat. For science, this means asking the question why each pea is its own unique round food. For us, peas are food, but a pea also dries out into a seed from which other pea plants can grow, if they are kept watered in good soil, without thorns. Sunlight is important for growing plants as well. A monk named Gregor Mendel lived and worked in a monastery. He also grew peas to see whether the ones with wrinkly seeds or with yellow instead of green seeds would breed peas that, when dried out as seeds, would have the same wrinkles or yellow color. For example, if 1 out of 4 peas being raised and bred have wrinkles, why was the pattern of the new pea seeds something close to 1 out of 4? Years later, scientists answering these questions caused the world to appreciate what this pea-breeding monk began doing in 1854. The life of the mind, our hopes and our dreams, are not passed on to our children the same way pea seeds have wrinkles or might be yellow. We get to know our parents, and children come into the world to their new home, a place families hope will be loving, stable, and blessed. But some things about us, like how tall we grow, or the color of our eyes, these things seem a lot like the peas. Scientists now believe they know the basic answers, which of course help lead us to new questions. It was a dream in the 1850s to gain such knowledge, but back then, the way colors and shapes get passed on from parents to their kids was a mystery of nature. A World's Fair is something like a big party in a park, where different shows from around the world try to be the best. Visitors would get all dressed up to go walk at the fair from show to show. Countries' shows helped people at the fair see why each one was special. England wanted to compete with France on having a great World's Fair, including the theme of industry. That word means making things like clothes made of cotton or machines made of metal. The husband of Queen Victoria was in charge of this and made a display of all the latest tools, the best machines of the British Empire in 1851. The man who wrote Alice in Wonderland was there, and so was the writer of A Christmas Carol, who made up the character Scrooge. Another man there at the fair was Charles Darwin. We can try to imagine what he thought. Looking back over the machines and tools before the middle of the 1800s, the steam engine and the electric telegraph were considered amazing. The idea that a machine did work and could move people and boxes of stuff had a power all its own. Boats could move on river canals better than before. The telegraph was about the simplest way to talk using electricity. Even Gauss had made a working telegraph between buildings at his school. In 1830, when Morse code was invented, letters were made into long and short bleeps, and the electricity was sent through a cable or line. This was long before anyone had electricity in their own house. It meant People could talk about things faster than ever before, but they had to do it using the simplest possible bleep messages. One of the men who owned rights to the idea of the telegraph was Charles Wheatstone, who helped a young nephew we will learn about later. English train travel also began carrying passengers on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. An astronomer friend of Rowan's believed that train was the greatest thing people had ever done, which made Rowan sad. A wonderful trend leading up to the middle 1800s was more people being able to use microscopes to see things and even creatures too small for us to see normally. London started its own special society in 1839 for this, and families with enough money began to have microscopes of their own, if they were interested. Looking close up at things we take for granted, such as flies, and making and sharing drawings, let people see into this living world of the small. While Darwin looked at his country showing off machines and tools in 1851 at the fair, he was in a huge glass building built just for the show. This palace of crystal was not the sort of thing people could stick their tongues out and make fun of. It was the pride of England. Many glass buildings have been built since then, but the building itself showed how industry could make ideas become big built structures. The industry show displayed the way cotton clothes began on the farm, grown from a plant, and then the textile was spun, woven, and sewn into clothes, the final product. Thinking back to 20 years before the fair, Charles Darwin was on a boat, seeing islands off the west coast of South America. Birds, turtles, and more gave him a view of nature, glorious in a way completely different from machines and clothes people make. Animals live in nature in a way completely different from how people live with our stuff. 8 years after the fair, Darwin wrote a book about the importance of having grandchildren who have grandchildren. As a child, there is no need to think about having children of your own yet. If you have a grandmother or grandfather who thinks you are very special, this connection is so powerful that Darwin thought it could be how human beings became the way we are. His idea was that the things like being short or tall could be like the things birds and turtles on the islands had. Their shapes, birds' beaks, lizards' snouts, changed based on nature and what was good for having grandkids. All these ways of being different would have been passed down through time by grandkids having grandkids of their own. The effort of individual lives, for instance, what people do with their lives or try to do, that was all different from some simpler idea of how a bird's beak could take on different shapes over lots of years, generations of birds, grandkid birds, living on nearby islands in the Pacific Ocean. One thing some people did not like about Darwin's idea was that this would take a really long time, more time than many people believed the world has even been here at all. Darwin's life is one example of thinking about the difference family makes. Darwin's own family was amazing for the way they tried to do science, and he followed after his own grandpa, who was a doctor inventor, and poet. Some of the science Darwin did was because his family and their money made it possible for him to study nature in a way he loved and admired. It was different for families with smart boys and less money. For example, the family in France of a man who had helped Napoleon fight, the Pasteur family. Louis Pasteur's dad had served under Napoleon, and Louis had sisters who were all proud he showed a talent for science. They had just enough money to manage to pay for his school. As Louis learned science, so did his family. Later in life, he showed the world how to protect people from little other kinds of families, different kinds of living things so small we can only see them with a microscope. His name is on many milk bottles because words that end in "ization" made Pasteur's science for protecting milk a label that a container of milk was safe to buy and drink. No too small to see families of other kinds of life were growing in it, because it had been heated, precisely. The people of France loved Louis because its farms were also safer, for example, their grapes and sheep and more. Another kind of family life led from Scotland to an important math test at Cambridge in England, just south of Scotland, on Britain's main island. That math test took days. Only young men, only boys, were allowed, which was unfair. Only the one who came in first could be sure he would get a top job. In 1845, a Scottish test-taker named William Thompson came in second. His family worried about trying to find him work as a teacher, even though Cambridge was helping him keep going to school there. He went from rowing in college to standing on the boats that traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, trying to bring an electric telegraph wire from Europe to North America. Queen Victoria made him a knight, and he was later made into a lord, Lord Kelvin. In 1852, Scotland's P.G. Tate came in first on this Cambridge math test. He fell in love with quaternions, and later wrote a science textbook with William Thompson. He studied quaternions with William Rowan Hamilton, mostly by mail, after they both were famous. James Clerk Maxwell and Tate were friends, beginning as younger boys, going to the same school in Scotland. Maxwell only came in second, too. He went on to use quaternions to explain what Michael Faraday had found in his experiments on electricity and magnets. Maxwell also started a brand new lab at Cambridge that went on to do amazing experiments much later on. These were the lucky boys, not as good at math as Gauss, but better than almost everyone else. Nobody knows what kind of being smart will matter later on. Some people think being smart is like yellow pea seeds, and they point to these men who are stars of science. But being smart is only the start, and it seems like really everyone can be if they try and keep trying. But home, family, food, love, ideas, and for many of these great people, the Bible, were all shared together. When you are older, you can read the letters some of these science families wrote to each other, including sisters and aunts. Darwin didn't need a job, but Pasteur and the math kids from Scotland did. Outside of school, business and industry were also growing more important and started to make new types of jobs for scientists and engineers. Jobs outside of teaching. People are smart in different ways, but working hard at science began for all these men when they were children. Doing well in school was important, and their families wanted them to have a good future. They started doing science young, in part by thinking about simple things in special ways. Birds, milk, magnets, math, the kind of smart that mattered, made them really want answers. They cared about so much more than school. The future they helped make is the world we live in together now. This book is a chance for families to share liking science with minds too young to even know all these sentences and words. Different children will have different questions, some new. Some kids will learn how to use science themselves to ask new questions, find new answers, and share their results with the world. But the family team is the first team a lucky young scientist can have.